Well, first of all, we don't seem to understand from where intelligence came from. We don't understand from where life came from on Earth, but that we can kind of intuit because that's in the space of chemistry and biology. You have good theories about the origins of life on Earth, but the origins of intelligent life, that is a giant mystery. And there's some sense in which, I mean, I don't know if you know the movie 2001 Space Odyssey, but it does seem that there's like important throughout human history, throughout life on Earth, there's important phase shifts of, it feels like something happened where there's big leaps. It could be something coincidental like fire and learning how to cook meat and all those kinds of things. But it feels like there could be other things. And I think that's at the core of your work, is exploring what those things could be. Is it possible? Talked about Joe Rogan offline. Is it, and it's entirely possible, is it possible that psychedelics have in fact contributed of being an important source of those phase shift throughout human history, of the intellect, basically steering the intellectual development and growth of human civilization?
It's a hypothesis worth investigating. How about that?
Beautiful.
and maybe not psychedelics in and of themselves, but I think our whole conversation is kind of wrapped up in these non-ordinary states of awareness. We start by talking about God, which is something unordinary and expansive. And I think that as you trace the intervention of divinity, if that's the case, throughout human history, you have to bump up against the irrational. Mircea Eliade, the great scholar of religions and fellow Romanian, said that the history of religions essentially constitutes the point of intersection between metaphysics and biology, right? So that we are biological beings who do interact with our planet, with the natural kingdom. And you would think that as, early archaic ecologists, we would have figured out what plants work, which fungi don't, and developed maybe language around that. And so this is another one of McKenna's speculative but very interesting hypotheses, the stoned ape theory. Mm-hmm. Is it possible that psychedelics were involved in one of the several leaps forward? You mentioned the word leap. Jared Diamond talks about the Great Leap Forward 60,000 years ago. The species had been around for a couple 100,000 years. All of a sudden, the cave painting appears. All of a sudden, there's a phase shift. Did something like that happen millions of years ago? And I love the way Paul Stamets talks about this. It would be the ingestion of perhaps psilocybin-containing fungi millions and millions of times over millions and millions of years. So it's not just a one-time event that cascades, but it's the accumulation of psychedelic experience. That it's really difficult to test that hypothesis. But I've been talking with a paleoanthropologist in South Africa, my friend Lee Berger, about ways that we might test for this. And so Lee, amongst many things, is this National Geographic explorer. He's the paleoanthropologist at the University of Witwatersrand. He's famous, amongst other things, for the discovery of previously undiscovered hominids like Homo naledi. And there's an interesting point. So naledi is this archaic hominid, morphologically archaic, but it dates to about 300,000 years ago, which is very strange. What's even more strange about Homo naledi at the Rising Star Cave System there in South Africa is that Lee believes he's discovered the first bipedal ape deliberately disposing of its dead. So there is a recognition of self-mortality and the practicing of rituals around death. We're talking about burials. And if you have burials, says Lee, in an archaic hominid 300,000 years ago, maybe you have language. And I mention that because Terence McKenna was obsessed with language in the stoned ape theory, that the ingestion of psilocybin, in addition to enhancing visual acuity, perhaps facilitating sexual arousal, leads to proto-language. Now, isn't it interesting, this could be entirely a coincidence, that the largest sound inventory of any language is the Khoisan of Botswana and Namibia. They have something like 164 consonants and 44 vowels. English, by comparison, has about 45. So I don't know what to make of this, but what you find in that part of the world is very, very complex language. Language that could be an inheritance, language that could be incredibly archaic, together with this recognition of self-mortality. And when I talk to Lee Berger, we say when you're looking at universals like that, language around all human populations, the recognition of self-mortality, the contemplation of death, just maybe you have pharmacology. And so maybe we can go out and test for this using gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, proteomics, technology that doesn't even exist. But maybe we can actually test the stoned ape theory to figure out once and for all if there's any merit there.
Can you just linger a little bit on the pharmacology tools? Like how would it be possible to say something about what was being ingested so long ago?
That's what I asked Dr. Berger. So Lee has discovered in the dental calculus
Nice.
of archaic hominids
Dental calculus. I like this.
evidence of their diet. And you might not believe how old this was, but in Sediba, Australopithecus sediba, they found evidence of Sediba's diet going back 2 million years. So through things like phytoliths, which are essentially fossilized plant tissue, they found evidence that Sediba was eating bark and leaves and grasses and fruits and palm. So no psychedelics to speak of, but it just goes to show that through things like dental microwear analysis and other techniques that we're still developing, we can actually figure out what the diet was at the time. I'll fast forward to 50,000 years ago. There was another study out of El Cidrón Cave in 2012, which found that Neanderthals, again, preceding our species 50,000 years ago, were ingesting yarrow and chamomile, which had been identified as medicinal. So again, not psychedelic or psychoactive, but we kind of have the beginnings of the technology, and that was 9 years ago, to begin figuring out the ancestral diet of these hominids.
Presumably there could be a way to figure out it's not just diet, but have psychoactive elements to them. So whether you're chewing it, whether you're smoking it, I don't know what, licking it. I don't know if there's any kind of ways through the dental calculus to figure out what exact substances were being consumed. Is it possible to figure out whether psychedelic substances are being consumed by looking at human behavior? Like you said, organized burials or cave paintings. No, but so that's a little bit of a stretch to say, like, where did this leap come from?
But it's not. It's not. So just last fall, as a matter of fact, so that notion's been out there for a while. The idea that hallucinogens and the ritual consumption of hallucinogens were somehow related to the Great Leap Forward, were somehow related to the initial cave painting. Graham Hancock wrote a beautiful book about this called Supernatural, which in many ways sent me down this rabbit hole back in 2007. And so, but even at the time when he was writing that and the years subsequent, it was still kind of seen as a kooky idea. Last fall, interestingly enough, the first archaeochemical data for the ritual consumption of psychedelics associated with cave art was finally published. It's not that ancient. It's only about 400 or 500 years ago, but it came from the Pinwheel Cave, a Chumash site in California. And what they found were datura quids, like these chewed up, you mentioned how did they ingest it? These chewed up quids, like these bunches of datura, which contain these very powerful tropane alkaloids, and what was believed to be some kind of Chumash initiation site. So we can say that there is initial, archaeochemical data for the consumption of psychedelics and cave art. And so where else might we find this?
Are there a lot of archaeochemists in the world? Like, because this is fascinating. Is through chemistry, through biology, through physics, whatever, like all the disciplines perhaps one day computer science, we apply those tools to study not the data of today, but the data of the past. Are we talking about dozens here? Like, how hard is this problem relative to how many people are taking it on? Just as a side little tangent.
We're probably talking more dozens than hundreds. Okay. I spent many years trying to track down an archaeochemist who would talk to me. There were a couple, Pat McGovern at the University of Pennsylvania, and then my friend Andrew Coe at MIT, which you might know something about. Andrew really, on his own time, on his own dime, has been gathering the data for this organic residue analysis. He has what's called the Open Archem project, which is this online open source repository for this data. But there's never been a center for this. No university has stood up a dedicated center, a team, really, which is what you need, of archaeochemists looking at this stuff. But I mean, even despite that, there have been some remarkable discoveries over the past 10, 20 years. It's still a discipline very much in its infancy. Maybe it's becoming a toddler, but as the technology gets better and cheaper, I hope you'll see more and more archaeochemists joining